Hello, welcome to this video on Philip Larkin. Again, this applies predominantly to Year 13 students undertaking their coursework, their NEA. This one is going to focus on Philip Larkin's poem, The Whitsun Weddings, and it will push you towards using it effectively in your coursework. On the screen there you can see Philip Larkin. Interesting fellow. You'll remember we discussed him in lessons. If you look at the URL here, this is one to go and have a look at. The Poetry Foundation, the sort of blurb, the essay on him that follows it is really quite detailed, and it's well worth having a look at just to understand the man a little bit better. This video needs to be fairly short. It's a prompt and a reminder, so let's read the poem. The Whitsun Weddings. That Whitsun I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out, all windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floating of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely. Hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of brass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made. Each station that we stopped at, sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade, and down the long cool platforms, whoops and skirls, I took for porters larking with the mails and went on reading. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the poems, the nylon gloves and jewellery substitutes, the lemons, mauves, and olive ochres that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round. The last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots, and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died. A dozen marriages got underway. They watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed. And as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight. Somewhere becoming rain. Right, a longish poem, lots going on, but this short video necessitates brevity. And so what you say about this poem is largely going to be determined by the perspective from which you look at it. Because if you're looking at this from the sort of so-called, inverted commas, feminist perspective, then you're pretty much going to be focusing on anything to do with the sections in the middle, the nature of weddings, what weddings mean, what weddings are for, why do people marry, what does marrying entail, discussions of women becoming the possession of the man, or men, I should say. The discussions of how the people look, mothers loud and fat, and then the discussion of the girls themselves here with their kind of colourful dresses. What's he saying here about, you know, the female species, if that's the right way to put it? What's he sort of implying here? Again, as we move on, he refers to women sharing the secret like a happy funeral. And if you do focus on the feminist perspective, then you're focusing on phrases like happy funeral. What does Larkin mean by happy funeral? Why is there this kind of juxtaposition of those words, that oxymoron in place? He refers in the line underneath that as girls who, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Goodness me, it's really quite graphic in some respects. Why are the girls gripping their handbags tighter? What does that imply about how they feel? Why are they staring? Religious wounding? What might this mean? In what way is marriage a sort of wound? There are so many things to sort of discuss just in those three stanzas there. If, however, you're looking at this poem from the perspective of the canon, which is where I think this poem probably does belong, then what you really need to do is you do need to grasp what the poem's about. So what is the poem about? Larkin's on a train from Hull to London, and as he makes his way from Hull to London, the stanzas reveal his different feelings as to what's going on. It's a sort of bank holiday in the spring, summer, Whitsun, and the poem begins with the description of him actually making his way on the train. And the first stanza, let's go through it reasonably quickly. He's making his way out of a busy town. Blinding windscreen, the fish dock, that kind of places us in Hull, where he spent the majority of his life as the librarian at the university. This is then continued in the second stanza, where there are descriptions of industrial froth, hot houses. So we're moving from sort of industrial northern England into the sort of shires. As he moves, he then introduces in the third stanza this notion of people getting married. You should look up why was it that people got married on Whitsun? Why was it this particular day? The contextual point here is that he's writing in the 1960s. These people are already married and they're going on their honeymoon. They're going on honeymoon to places like, Whitstable, Bournemouth. They're going to the seaside, the great British seaside, for their honeymoon. It might not be what you aspire to, but it's what people used to do. And so the greatness of the poem arguably is coming alive here because he's writing about normal things. It's the normality of it, which he elevates into something sort of quite profound. Why? Partly because we're shown northern industrial England, and then we kind of move south towards London, and we're shown different views of the world. But as he shows us England, pastoral England, beautiful England, as well as maybe sort of not so beautiful, grim England, he's also commenting quite significantly on the nature of relationships, why people marry, and why people stay together, how they celebrate these marriages. I think it's really quite impressive. If we then also add to that the beautiful style, you may notice that as I was reading it, I wasn't having to do very much at all in actual fact. I was just reading it. Because he uses iambic pentameter, it lends itself, the ba-boom, 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 the 5 lots of 2, one stressed, one unstressed, it lends itself to this sort of natural sing-song, as if he's just observing, he's just noticing the things that are going on. But by holding to this quite formal style, the style that Hardy would have used, the style that Shakespeare would have used, he's placing himself in this great tradition of British, English, poetry, but poetry, this great tradition of poetry. He's placing himself firmly in the middle of that. The profound, the normal are kind of pushed together, but with this high, grand style. So as we move down through the poem, his observations become slightly more observant. Not terribly good English, but that's the truth of it. He notices things. That's what these middle stanzas are about. Before, as we move on, the discussion of the girls. And then as they move on, we've got this description of how London comes into view. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, someone running up to bowl. I love that line. I love those lines there. I love them because I think it really does capture what he thinks, what Larkin thinks England is like at the time. You've got an Odeon, a cinema, perhaps symbolic of this desire for escape. You can consider there why people go to the cinema. A cooling tower, it's something to do with industrial England, and then someone running up playing cricket. This sort of quintessentially English moment. And then he says here, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. What he's saying here is that this wedding is an hour in people's lives. It's a day in the life. Weddings are perhaps notable because these are, at your wedding, you're likely to have a number of people who are in a room together for that one time and that one time alone. It's unlikely that those people, all of them, will ever be in the same room ever again. And that's what he's saying there. Again, I think the profundity, the reason it's profound is because it's so true. And as those people are doing that, he's thinking here about London and his where he's going to end up. There we were aimed, and as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close. And it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence. So as we move again into a city, we've got this blackened moss, this sense of decay, and perhaps Larkin is telling us here that these weddings, these relationships are somewhat doomed because they're heading to a place, London in this instance, which is kind of decaying, which is blackened. And it's not a terribly positive or happy note. He's saying here that it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence. What he means there is that the journey on the train is nearly over. But he says here, and what it held stood ready to be loosed, with all the power that being changed can give. The most important word out of all of those is this one here. If I can make it work, I can make it work. Changed. Because he's saying here that as a consequence of the journey, there is a kind of change. For the people at their wedding, or on their way to their honeymoon, to be more accurate, the change is this newfound relationship. But he is saying here that he is also changed as a consequence of seeing it. Seeing the people on their honeymoon, seeing their happiness. Maybe he's saying that he sees through the happiness, that his cynicism about the construct of marriage, about these relationships, maybe that's what his change is, or maybe not. The last few lines, we slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain. And that's so grim. It's such a grim way to finish a poem which is about marriage and about the movement from one city to another city. But he's saying here that what he feels is a sense of falling. It's swelling. It's almost overwhelming him. The sense of decay, whether it's moral decay, the decay of a relationship. And he compares it, using that simile, like an arrow shower. think archers aiming their arrows into the sky and firing them off into the distance with the hope of hitting something. What do? Those arrows, if fired all in unison, they rain down on other people. So a poem which, depending on what your question is or what you want to do with it, gives you a chance to discuss whether it's any good or not, whether it's great. I certainly think it is. I think it's fantastic. I think it's incredibly sophisticated. And I think the meaning of it is, while not one I agree with, one that I think is, well, he articulates it very well indeed. If you're focusing on marriage, feminism, Marxism, that notion of marriage as a construct which controls people is, I think, terribly important. But there's so much to be doing with this. The key is read up on him, so you're kind of completely aware of the details, and depending on your question, focus on the key moments, the bits that give you a chance to show off your detailed knowledge of the text. We must remember we're writing English essays, not sociology ones, so focus on the text. And if you do that, the work's likely to be good. Good luck.